And welcome to this installment of Recall Rescue Roundtable. I'm really happy to be sharing some significant information here today. And joining us, we have Dr. David Mahoney, who is not only a lawyer related to in the area of FDA regulated products, but he's also a professor and someone I work with. And for our audience, David, will you share a little bit about yourself?
Yes. So for background, I've been happy to be teaching FDA regulation now for more than a decade at Northeastern University. And I'm also currently working and have been working in the biotechnology space with regard to regulation and legal matters.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I'm our host for today. I'm Dr. Darren Detweiler, also at Northeastern University, and I have been working in regulated areas for almost 3 decades now, and working with many different elements of the USDA and the FDA. And in fact, I just got back recently from speaking before the Association of Food and Drug Officials, looking at some of the challenges ahead. And I think that's a really good theme for us to look at today, but looking at the idea of some of the regulatory challenges ahead of us, but from a more of a legal perspective. In our first Recall Rescue Roundtable webinar, we kind of looked at kind of setting the stage. Are you recall ready? What is a recall? Those kind of elements. But I thought that this session, let's go ahead and take a look a little bit more at the legal side of things. David, really quick, just to kind of establish a baseline here, where does the actual authority for the FDA in terms of recalls come from?
Well, so the authority for FDA's authority with recalls really stems, obviously, essentially from federal jurisdictional basis, as we know, and that's general governmental agency authority coming in to play with that. We've seen that come to fruition in a number of different cases. Actually, one of the first cases I deal with on in one of my classes deals with the Gibbons v. Ogden case, and that actually was the case that established the federal jurisdictional basis for administrative agencies. Now, moving forward from that, the power of the FDA as a governmental agency has progressed over the years, and we've seen that historically through different actions of the FDA in being able to control types of recalls. Ordinarily, when people think of recalls, it's typically company initiated. However, from a historical basis, we look at the right of the FDA to actually mandate biological recalls. We see that stems from the Childhood Vaccine Act back in 1986. And then we see a progression of there as well in looking at the Food and Drug Modernization Act, where that allows the FDA to mandate recalls under certain circumstances for food. And the FDA also has the ability to recall and mandate recalls for not only medical devices, but also for certain controlled substances.
Well, I think it's important to note too that when we have these changes, they don't just necessarily open the door wide open for the FDA in terms of what they can do. Many times it's saying you can only open the door, if you will, to use that phrase, so much. There are certain limits in terms of what the FDA can do in these events.
No, exactly. I like your illustration of it kind of opening the door, because that's exactly really what it is, where you have the statutory provisions that allow for the authority of the FDA, but in instances where there is a matter of dispute, that's of course where we defer to the court's interpretive application of it. And that's really what the role of the court is. A lot of people sometimes will look at news headlines and see, well, there's case law being developed and things of that nature, but that's not really true law. What the role of the court is an interpretive function in the government. And in looking at that, we see certain legal issues that have come up, in fact, where the court does defer to the authority of the FDA, where it hasn't always been clear. And that's actually come up in the issue of things like federal preemption, primary jurisdiction, and aspects of that nature. So I don't know if you wanted to delve into those cases yet, or we'll hold that off for a little bit later.
Let's hold off a little bit. I mean, I
Okay.
think that what we see here is this is like high school civics, right? The Congress literally writes what is the authority of the FDA. The FDA and the executive branch executes that authority, but the courts can be used in terms of interpreting when there are some challenges, when there's questions, what exactly is that authority? And it all kind of comes together in terms of how this plays out, not only for patients and consumers, but also for industry.
Correct. Absolutely. And that's really the idealized role of it, is on those functions: legislative creating the laws, the judicial branch interpreting those and how they apply, and essentially, as we know, with the FDA being under the executive branch, enforcing those laws. And where's that balance of power lying between really the executive and the judicial is sometimes where it comes into play. And sometimes we have plaintiffs that really try and push the envelope. They really want to try and push their agenda through the court system, but the courts many times have wisely taken a step back and looking at the intent of what the statutory authority is of the FDA and allowing for the discretion of the FDA to hold true and not overly interfering with the FDA's role in enforcing those types of provisions and utilizing its discretionary authority as such.
Well, and one question I hear often from my students and from other people is, well, why doesn't the FDA just charge them with this? Why doesn't the FDA charge them with that, crime or whatever? And I have to tell folks that, well, the FDA doesn't have the authority to do that. They have to literally hand over a case to the Department of Justice.
Exactly. So that the FDA is working hand in hand with the DOJ, the Department of Justice, in working with those matters. And of course, the FDA's approach too is not necessarily trying to bat entities and companies over the head initially. That's not what they want to do. The approach really is to try and work with companies. And we see that through with the regulations that apply to recalls, that the first shot is not simply to just stranglehold companies, but rather to work with companies and try and help guide them through the process. Even when there's a voluntary recall, you have FDA officials that are helping work with the companies through that process. And that's the idealized portion of it. If it really gets to the point where the FDA, as you mentioned correctly, is handing it over and working with the Department of Justice in bringing a legal case against an entity, something's gone wrong. Either the company hasn't really followed the proper protocols of responsiveness to the FDA, or there is a significant combination of that along with a very serious risk to the public health, and that the FDA really has no choice at that point but to take action through legal means and enforcement.
Well, right now in our current landscape, if you will, there seems to be a lot of concern and criticism by not only groups, NGOs, advocacy groups, but even legislators, that the FDA is not mandating a lot of recalls, that they're allowing industry to do voluntary recalls. Why would there be that approach drive from the FDA to go down the voluntary as opposed to the mandating a recall?
Right, and that's an excellent point bringing up on people's perception. And I think what happens is sometimes that perception is somewhat skewed by the people's lack of knowledge of what's actually going on behind the scenes with the communication. So even in the instance of, say, like a voluntary recall, there's communications most often of the time going in between the FDA and those companies. It may be on the part of the company as a voluntary recall, but there's been discussion, there's advice, there's guidance that the FDA is providing for that it's very rarely just entirely a company solely initiated recall. I mean, there might be in some instances when we're looking at things that may not necessarily be a violation under the FDCA. If you're looking at, say, like stock, changeover, maybe correct, simple things that wouldn't actually be an enforcement action. But for the most part, when we're talking at the level of a recall due to the fact of a potential danger to the public, even if it's a voluntary one, more cases than not, that's been due to a communication between the FDA and the company. And even in those instances, the FDA does provide or serve as a role in working with the company to determine that that recall is being processed in the correct manner, that all the retailers or distributors, how the case may be applicable, have been contacted by the company. And in fact, the FDA will audit records of the company with regard to these recall matters and communications. And the recall, the FDA really will not provide a recommendation for a cessation of this voluntary recall in that instance until really all possible individuals that need to be notified have been notified, and that product now is no longer a risk to the public health.
And even I know of late, I believe it's been the past decade, the FDA's also really put a lot of resources and money into efforts to make sure that we shorten that period of time for a recall. The rapid response team working with the states to make sure that, it's not going to be a recall that takes forever, because that does not serve the purpose. How can we, better support from the federal level down to make sure these recalls are quick and rapid and effective as at the same time. So looking at voluntary examples and involuntary examples, what's a mandatory recall? Can you talk about an example on each side of those? An example of a recent voluntary recall and an example of a mandatory recall, and why those might have been different?
Right. So probably some of the larger, so you're looking at this morning, I actually looked at what current recalls are in effect right now for drugs and for biologics. Right now, there's no current recalls in effect according to the FDA website as of today for biologics. There are for drugs, though. Many of those are not really of a huge serious nature. The most relevant ones I could find currently deal with, say, microbial contamination for certain types of products. In particular, I saw one for milk and magnesia. But looking historically, maybe within the past, since 2000, we know in the case of a voluntary recall, there was the issue of Vioxx, and that was what was considered to be, as many of us know in the regulatory field, the largest drug recall, just due to the number of prescriptions that were in place in connection with that drug. And that was a voluntary recall. Of course, again, the FDA played a role in working with Merck as part of that. And that was an example of a product that really needed to be recalled due to the safety issues at the public. On a more recent example, we're looking at a mandatory instance, and we're looking at an example of which, when you mentioned voluntary versus involuntary and the FDA's roles I was talking about, is really ideally to help guide companies along and lead them to that voluntary status. We look at the instance of Triangle Pharma Naturals, and that was in 2018, and that dealt with a contamination they had in their product. The FDA had contacted them and asked them to initiate a voluntary recall. The company failed to respond. The FDA again contacted them with a notification of opportunity to actually initiate a recall given 24 hours response time. They failed again to respond to the FDA. At that point, the FDA had no choice, they felt, but to mandate and actually initiate a recall for that product. And it was successfully recalled, but that was an instance where it was not, again, simply an instance of the FDA stepping in, trying to stranglehold a company. They really took a stepwise and measured approach to working with Triangle Pharma Naturals, but the company was unresponsive. And of course, time was ticking away. It was a salmonella contamination issue, which of course we know can be quite serious in dealing, depending on the individuals that are exposed to that in particular. So that was a very good example, I think, of showing how the FDA makes a measured approach with it, but still was able to effectuate that stronger regulation. They now head for mandated recalls under the Food Safety Modernization Act. And hopefully those show individuals just how important the FDA's role is, and it's not simply to take away that free market ability of the companies, but rather just simply trying to guide, but when that's not working,
Sure.
laying down the hammer to protect the public health.
Well, and to go through those steps of escalation, you don't just start at the most restrictive, if you will. You start at the least restrictive engagement in terms of trying to get this returned. I think it's important to note too, we just had the 40th anniversary of that 1980s Tylenol scare.
Yes.
And it's funny because most people over a certain age, when we talk about pharmaceutical recalls, things like that. It's amazing. Like you said, oh, I went to the webpage, I saw what's going on currently. The average person doesn't look at this kind of stuff, but what they do remember are those things that gathered the biggest headlines. That Tylenol scare of almost 40 years ago. I mean, how it is. I have got graduate students who are rather young, and I tell them that, there was a time you could go to the grocery store and you could just open up a box of pills and there was no safety seal. There was no wrap around it. There was no, you have to rip off the seal. There was no this. You didn't have lot codes and date codes and certain things. Even, like foods, right? Yogurt or whatever. You could just open up a thing of yogurt. There was no plastic seal. But sometimes these events not only challenge us in terms of the regulatory authority, but they end up changing the way industry, not just a company, but how industry reacts to how do we prevent this issue from happening again? How do we, make changes to try to not find ourselves in this situation over and over and over again? Do you encounter some of those reactions from your students as well?
Well, we actually use it's interesting you bring up the Tylenol example because we actually use that as a very important case study in one of our classes. And of course, it is because it really set forth the gold standard of responsiveness. Because what was really unique about that particular crisis and the recall had to do with the unknown. It was something that was completely hit the company out of left field. They had no idea but they had to go through the same normal process with it. Much of what they did, in approaching it, they went above and beyond industry standards. Now, granted, after that time, there were other issues with Tylenol, but that was the one shining moment they had with it. And it set forth a new precedent for really bringing notice to consumers, to the industry via media. They utilized media in an excellent format. It was something that already they had the ability to, because being the company they were already very media savvy, but they leveraged that to an extremely good advantage for them and for the consumer as well, but also having good crisis management. They had individuals in place with their team that made a huge difference on how they were going to find through the supply chain. Now, granted, we looked at supply chain issues. We've seen those are huge problems that were shown with pandemic related matters. So with recall, it's critically important the companies need to know where the product's being made from, where it's being distributed to, geographically distribution regions. And that's exactly what they did in looking at. They were able to pinpoint where were these cases most likely centered. They found the distribution center working up the supply chain through there. Search through, performed inspections, shut down, of course, distribution of the product, initiated the recall of bringing that product back in more than they actually needed to do at the time, was at the time extremely expensive. And through this whole process, as you mentioned, now we have the standard of triple packaging for products, which now people jokingly get aggravated and say, I can't even open this. And the only person that can really open it seems to be, somebody who's not supposed to be able to open it. But the fact of the matter is, what came out of that was an excellent example for companies to follow. And, you see that reflected as well in the FDA's guidance for recall strategies and how those things should be approached. They specifically mention, now granted, being guidance, we know that that's not mandatory, but it is guidance for it. And that's something that the new version of that has been published as of the beginning in March of 2022. People have likely seen, if they've researched this, looked at the guidance back in 2019, the draft guidance was provided. But again, that guidance is, you'll see basically the historical legacy of the Tylenol crisis coming through in certain parts of that when you read through it, because you'll see these certain aspects of how to approach it, having a team in place, having a recall plan in place, and in fact, what it is the companies should be doing to be diligent.
Sure. Well, let's shift just a little teeny bit here. I'm glad you brought up the idea of early this year, 2022. There seems to be in Q1 of this year a big regulatory shift in medical device industry with the FDA's move to harmonize U.S. medical device manufacturing standards with those of other nations. It seems to me like, while most experts agree that this will make things easier for device manufacturers, there's still concerns about, if we try to standardize things on like globalized standards, right? There remains these burdens, if you will, on smaller companies, especially looking at the timeline that the FDA has laid out. And I think that we have to take into consideration Tylenol, like we were just talking about, major company. If that scare had happened for a very smaller company, the response, the recall could have been very different. So we can look at this here in terms of the idea of medical device standards. And I don't know if this is going to be seen as a barrier to industry, a barrier to market, but we definitely see when you have this kind of, well, one could say monopoly, one could say centralizing, one could say consolidation, but even looking at infant formula, we don't have a large selection of companies that do the infant formula, and some of these companies that do infant formula are also doing pharmaceuticals, and there's some significant case study or some significant legal history, if you will, with these companies. All this focus right now on infant formula is with a company that's got a long history of interactions with the FDA. And I think there's a lot of pressure on this new permanent commissioner for the FDA in terms of going forward, looking at some of these issues. What are your thoughts on the global harmonization or the pressures on the FDA in the light of big and small companies?
Well, I mean, those are excellent points, and it's a difficult balance, because on the one hand, the easy answer is, without looking, as you mentioned, those more complicated intricacies of the large versus the medium and small companies, is to just have one standardized solution. But in doing such, are you really weeding out a lot of the smaller competitive players that could have a future role to play in helping stabilize more sustainable supply chain availability for these types of products? Or are you simply creating an atmosphere and landscape for simply just extremely large companies to continue dominating those particular fields? And when you have one or two issues that affect one or more of those companies, you've essentially affected the entire availability, or a very significant portion of that availability of that type of product for the population at large. And as you mentioned with the infant formula issues that have come up, it's, of course, something that people are very concerned about. Not only we're very concerned about food safety in general, whether, of all things, drugs, medical devices, and food safety, but when you're talking about infants, they're a class of population of humans that can be very susceptible, we know, to these types of contaminated issues. General population adults, healthy adults, may not be as so much, but you're dealing with anything, either be for nutrition for infants and nutrition for seniors. These are things where individuals may have developing or compromised immune systems that affect their ability to fight off these types of matters and contaminations. And how do we approach that in a measured way is, I think really a balancing act of ensuring that companies can comply, setting up regulations that allow companies to comply at all levels of the economic scale. And that's a lot easier said than done, I know. I don't mean to sound like simply like an easy political answer saying, well,
Oh,
this is what
no.
we're
I
going
mean,
to do.
I completely get it. I mean, you don't want to be like, you know, well, the school's going to pick up your children I'm sorry, the school bus is going to pick up your children, but hey, we have a new driver, so don't expect him to be safe in getting your kids to school. Well, we don't say, hi, I'm a doctor, I'm going to prescribe this drug, but it's from a small company that hasn't been around long, so don't have high expectations in terms of its effectiveness and safety. There's a general assumption that all products all are safe, regardless from a company that's huge and established, or new to the market and not as well established. Approved means you have met a standard.
Right. And no, exactly. And I think that makes an excellent point. And really hits home when you give the example of, other aspects of the analogy with that. And from there, I don't think there can be any compromise from a legal standpoint or regulatory standpoint for safety. But what I think we need to look at, and particularly looking at the recent case of infant formula, is dealing with how do we enable smaller companies to meet higher expectations of recall standards if those recall standards impose an undue financial burden or almost an impossible financial burden on companies that are below a certain market cap. And those are things to look at. I'm not a legislator or anything of that nature, but possibilities include setting up an available fund for companies, whether it be like a government funded basis, so that if companies need to tap into that they can get an immediate business loan to be able to access that they maybe will pay back later, that they're not getting a gift on that, but that it puts them on the same footing that if they need to have to upscale for a recall, they can have access to that immediately, because obviously in the middle of a crisis, you're not going to be in a good situation as a smaller company to go get a lot of investor money rolling in. That'd be about the worst time to be getting it. But to be able to have access to funds that would allow those types of entities to meet those requirements, if in fact they do require a level of economic hardship that normally could be footed only by larger companies. That's my 2 cents on it. I don't know how far it will go.
Sure. Well, you've brought up risk, you've brought up threat level and crisis level, but there's so many different things that are being evaluated, not just safety, recall, readiness. And we're going to talk about being ready and having a plan for recall in just a minute. But everything from risk evaluation, sustainability, social impact, environmental impact, regulatory compliance. There's a lot of different between ESG and for environmental sustainable governance, a lot more. And much of this is not so much the government looking at this data, at least that I'm aware of at this time. We're talking about venture capitalists, we're talking about insurance companies, we're talking about bigger industry evaluation. So there's a lot more than just product safety and things of that nature that are being looked at today. Many things that are not, again, the average consumer is not necessarily looking at those, but in the bigger picture of things, we're evaluating even the ethics, the philanthropy, the corporate social responsibility of executives within those companies, some of the things that are kind of the chicken and the egg kind of a thing? Is it the ethics that reveals the failure in terms of regulatory compliance, or is it the regulatory compliance that created this breakdown in ethics or failure in terms of corporate social responsibility? There's a lot of balance that we need to look at there. But I think that one thing, and consider this a segue, if you will, keeping an eye on our time here, I want to look at the idea you and I have been talking about, regardless if it's a small company or a huge company or anything, how critical it is from not only just a logistical standpoint, but from a legal standpoint. Companies have adequately planned for recalls.
Right.
Talk with me about this, the idea of we talked about the idea of not just having a strategy while in crisis mode. We need to be prepared for all modes. What are your thoughts on again, planning for recalls from your lens or through your lens?
Well, so funny you ask, because it doesn't even need to be through my lens, because actually this relates back to the guidance on the initiation of voluntary recalls that the FDA finalized for 2022. Again, the original draft came out in 2019, but they actually specifically addressed these very issues in it. The companies should be prepared for recall. And it involves things that ordinarily, I mean, aren't really complicated. I mean, they're talking about identifying appropriate personnel for recall. And this includes really in looking at harkening back to, as we've mentioned about the Tylenol crisis, about crisis management. We see an overlap with the issues of a company properly preparing for crisis management and also preparing for a recall, because for a pharmaceutical food company or device company, those most likely are going to be going hand in hand a lot of times. Having a communications plan, that again was displayed by the Tylenol example, where you have to have a communications plan, not only with the distributors, not only with the retailers, but depending if that product is also available and has already been purchased by consumers, having a public communication for it. So you might, in the one regard, have a specialized communication for those retailers or hospitals or physicians, but also a general one in the instance if that is out in the public sphere of purchase and the consumers need to be able to access that. Then looking at reporting requirements for the products with the coding on them. So again, that's going on to supply chain, and it's making sure the companies are relevant in having the most up-to-date and useful means of tracking these types of products, because we need to be able to take advantage of the digital technologies that are available in trying to track these and know exactly where they've come from and being able to pinpoint in crosshairs where exactly this problem might be emanating from. Keeping records, of course, and things of that nature, and also looking at how they're actually going to approach the initiation of the recall for that matter as well. So the FDA has really tried to set this forth over a period of a number of years. I think the guidance took a little longer than normal to actually be published due to a number of issues, of course, with the pandemic coming in between. I think we would have seen the final one a little bit sooner. But that's certainly something that makes sense. And from my estimation, looking at the Tylenol crisis, again, it's hearkening back those key practical aspects. I mean, there's nothing in here that you'd scratch your head at and think, oh, well, this is real. Why are they coming up with this? Or I have to research as to why they're doing that. It's really almost practical sense put down with some more specifics.
Are there, I guess for lack of a better word, are there legal consequences if a company doesn't have a plan for recall?
Well, you look at the legal consequences, and of course, their recommendations are simply just guidance. But when you're looking at aspects where a company has failed to meet certain requirements under the FDCA, then of course there are legal obligations there. I mean, we know the basics for labeling, and warning labels, things of that nature. Anything involving that would clearly be an enforceable action through the court system. when you look at a company now outside of just FDA regulated matters, with some of these larger companies we're talking about, of course, they're publicly traded. They have certain responsibility to their investors. Now, in that sphere, you're looking at instances, are companies misleading or are they actually violating the rights of shareholders? Or have they misled them in those types of instances? Like for instance, they didn't take the proper steps for a recall that led to further injuries. That, of course, affects the share price of the company. So now you might have an investor action. You have a company that maybe doesn't report all results on a clinical trial. Now we know that that's both a violation of the FDCA, but it also can be a violation of shareholder rights, that they basically can hold that a company has manipulated the stock value by withholding pieces of information. So companies definitely have to be careful with that. And their best course of acting in a diligent manner is really following the recommendations by the FDA. Now, that doesn't mean that just following the recommendations is a bulletproof plan, that everything is going to work out all right. But if they choose not to follow those types of recommendations, they're just opening themselves up to many more potential liabilities, not only from the FDA, but also from civil lawsuits as well.
We actually have some questions here from participants. One is the idea of enforcement trends, looking at unilateral actions. What are unilateral? What are unilateral actions in terms of enforcement that you're aware of?
So that brings us to another new aspect in 2022. So that was presented on the basically for unilateral action on the part of the FDA. There is a bill in front of the House of Representatives that was sponsored by Representative Delora of Connecticut. And essentially that's Bill 6834. It's in basically committee right now in the Subcommittee of Health. But that bill essentially is trying to establish a greater unilateral ability and right of the FDA to mandate recalls for drugs that it deems to be unsafe if certain procedures have not been followed, again, for voluntary recalls to be put in place by such companies. So these are some forward-looking aspects that it's not clear whether this will actually be set forth as a law. Currently, there are no co-sponsors of it, so there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of legislative support on it at this point in time. That doesn't mean that it won't move forward, but I don't want to mislead people, and from what the data that's available now, that it necessarily will move forward into a law. But it's something that people are thinking about.
Right, but I think too, this really kind of sets a tone, if you will, in terms of if you look at this new unilateral approach, if you look at the idea of the concern over the FDA of mandated versus voluntary recalls, if you look over at a lot of the recent concern overshadowing the FDA right now, there's some pressure, not only in terms of the role of the FDA commissioner, the role of the drug side versus the food side. There's been concern over an imbalance, if you will, but even the idea of this like single agency, like there's too many agencies involved, especially on the food side, but really kind of re-envisioning the future of regulatory compliance, of recalls, and can this be done more efficiently and effectively? Because if you look at the systems we have today, most of them were derived nearly 100. Well, obviously there's been advances, but something that was derived a century ago does not necessarily work in the current market. And even within this current market, you have now we have vaping devices and electronic nicotine delivery systems, and we have change on the food side. We have things that are beyond brick and mortar retail and restaurant in terms of how people are getting food and how those systems are disrupting the various distribution, if you will, supply and demand distribution systems what most of our current laws and regulatory compliance issues were developed in one setting, if you will, but that landscape has changed. I think that we're going to continue to see not only a pressure for reform to address changes in industry and changes in consumer behavior, but we're also going to see changes in terms of legal consequences and even economic considerations when it comes to regulatory compliance. I want to make sure you have some kind of last thoughts on this in terms of the idea again of legal challenges and changes going ahead that you either are thinking about or you kind of predict from again through your lens.
I mean, I think in looking forward on how things in the future is, yes, it makes sense that people are going to be concerned about, and there will be more advocacy for having a more centralized process. As we know, it wasn't a grand plan of having the USDA and the FDA separately. Those are things that kind of just grew up organically, separately with it. As we're getting into more development too with technology, we're getting into more access of information and data as they become available. Those are going to become a lot more relevant in issues involving recalls. They're going to become a lot more relevant in issues involving individuals as consumers buying and purchasing drugs and things of that nature. We've already seen that type of development for data protection coming into play, and some acts and bills that are even coming up into the US as well.
That kind of Venn diagram overlap between HIPAA and general data protection. The idea of, can the government get more access to data to help out with a recall? Okay, but wait a minute, what about access to people's private information? And then there's of course proprietary information with companies. You start really having multiple levels of complexity in these issues.
Right, and those are going to be just like anything else with any other new technology and new developments. It's going to be how we utilize it, and how can we best utilize this to not only make the basically approach of the governmental agencies in a much more consistent way, in a much more standardized way, but also ensuring that broader access to information isn't confining individuals' rights of privacy. And as always, it's always a balancing act. The same concepts are going to be in play. It's just that we're going to be dealing with different applications of them in different technologies. I mean, that's really been the example throughout history. A lot of times people will look at, we have it's very different now. It's like, well, we have the same fundamental concepts as people and our rights and what we're trying to do here. And for the regulatory aspects in the FDA, we're looking to protect was generally the health of the public. But we're also needing to balancing that also with ensuring that individuals are treated with dignity and respect in how their information is processed, that they're not simply just going to be utilized for the sole benefit of one purpose of saying, like, making things, quote, more safe. We've got to strike that balance in between, that we want to make things more safe. We want to ensure that people can feel and continue to feel going forward, even as technology changes, that they have confidence in the food that they're buying, in the products that are being prescribed to them, in the devices that are being maybe implanted them or used for their future use. And who knows what we'll have in the future that's actually that we can only think of imaginatively now. But the pure concepts will be the same, that we want to keep people healthy, we want to protect the public, but we also want to balance those rights, but still make sure that the agencies are strong enough to do what they need to do without becoming overpowering.
Great. That is an incredible note to end on. Dave Mahoney, professor, lawyer, and much appreciated guest on this show. Thank you very, very much. I'm Dr. Darren Detweiler. I've been your host, and I'm going to hand it back over to Jill Frank, who's going to close out our session.
First of all, guys, thank you so much. This was so informative, and I know that our watchers are going to be very educated about what to look out for in the coming months and possible coming years. As Darren mentioned, I am Jill Frank. I'm the VP of Marketing for Retriever Recall Management and Mock Recalls. And we are the sponsor of this webinar series. And our next webinar is coming up on November 15th. And Dr. Darren Detweiler will also be our host, our esteemed host to our webinar series this year and in our next coming months. And that series will be about technology and what are the best ways to handle data SWOT and opportunity solutions and analysis of technology and so much more. So thank you all for showing up for the webinar series, and until next time.